And one of the things that I really started to identify was with crankbaiting, seeing how a fish hits a bait, how they're actually eating it, all the telltale signs that you're telling you for when and how to make changes. Now, I'll get a lot of clients in my boat that when I'm throwing crankbaits, they'll connect on a fish, or I'll see them, they'll miss a fish, they'll miss another fish on their next cast, then they'll catch a small walleye, get, a little 16, 17-inch walleye, and it's just barely hooked by that last treble hook. And I'm handing them another rod with another bait. They're just kind of looking at me dumbfounded like, wait a minute, I'm getting bit on this thing. Why are you changing me out? And what I found is by making quick, subtle changes in what and how you're presenting your crankbaits, you can turn around and make some very major changes on things. Typically what I'm going to be going over is what are the fish telling you? When you're looking at how they bite, how they're hooked, the changes that you should be made. When is it time to say when do you make those changes, how frequent I'm making changes, and what I'm doing next, and then a little bit about quality and the type of baits that I'm using. But looking at this, when I'm fishing a river or I'm throwing cranks, like I said, I'm looking for a very aggressive bite. So what I take a look at is when these fish are eating baits, what are they telling me? And you see the common thing that's going on. These baits are just inhaled in their mouth. Baits in, you can see sucked all the way in, lifting their mouths open to see it. And what they're telling me every time is they're eating these baits. They're coming up, they're just inhaling on them. They could be neutral fish that are getting super aggressive. They want something. One of my favorites, 13-inch bucktail and a 12-inch bass sucking it in. The aggression, I just love it. That's what drives me and gets my blood pumping, so that's what I'm always looking for. And just paying attention to how they're eating that. On the contrast, this is the type of things that I start looking for, is bringing a bass up, one hook just barely in the lip. I classify blade baits as being the same thing as crankbaits. I fish them very similar, but same thing. Last treble hook, just barely in the mouth. It's not that good aggressive thump. And just some more variations of it, but all of these were saying the same thing. These fish are doing what I call a curiosity bump. When you got fish that are in a neutral mood, sometimes negative, coming into a neutral mood, what they're going to do is when they're coming up to that crankbait, typically like walleyes, they're going to flare their gills out, and especially if they're not in an aggressive mode, they're just coming up behind that bait. They flare their gills and they just suck the bait back. And a lot of times what you're feeling with that, when you're cranking it along, that walleye is just up behind it, flares its gills back. That first kind of thump that you're feeling is just the bait stopping as it's just nipping down the back of the bait because it's not really rolling up on that. So what I'm looking for is if I'm not getting them where they're sucked in, same thing like with bass, if I'm getting just barely hooked into there, when the fish got the front, caught the front treble hook, but still the same thing. They're just coming up, they're just doing that nip. What I'm looking for is where that fish is gonna come on the side, they're gonna take that bait sideways, or they're coming up on that bait and rolling. And often, like with bass, you'll just feel that, you're cranking and all of a sudden it's not like a good hard thump on there, it's just more like a tick, like a walleye, just to stop the bait or dead weight on there. And that's all they're doing, is they're just coming up that little, what is that thing, should I eat it? And they're just more or less looking to mouth the thing. So, as I said, what I'm looking for is kind of the difference of when I'm paying attention to it. If they're giving me a hard, aggressive bite, I'm going to be out with the hemostats, digging it out of their mouth. When I'm seeing this, just barely hooked, what I'm doing is jumping in right away, making quick changes on that. The two changes that I'm looking at right away is color and profile. I have been going much more into the natural patterns of baits, and I find that I consistently get bit more aggressively. But between that, I'm really looking at more of a lipless bait, stick bait, and into the body baits. body baits being something that's a little bit more oblong or like in a crayfish pattern. When I start looking at colors, and again, as I mentioned, I've really been doing so much better in natural patterns as opposed to like, not to specifically call it a manufacturer, but like with flicker shad. You'll see that they'll be in very non-traditional colors that just don't have a realistic appearance to them. And I find with those baits, I'll get bit a lot, but I don't get that aggressive bite where I am with the more in the natural spectrum. But what I'm looking at is if I'm taking and getting nipped on even in the crayfish, if it's something in this profile, I get hit 2-3 times and I'm not getting that hard sucking in bite, I'll take something from in a light neutral and I'll jump into something in the darker range. By the same token, if I'm up in the more kind of neutral range and I'm getting that, I'll jump into something that's going to give me more brighter. Your yellows are going to reflect a lot more light, your chartreuses. And that's where I'll just, very subtle. I'll usually, if I'm throwing a lighter colored bait, I'll go right to something that's darker, throw right back into that same area. And if I'm not getting bit in 3-4 casts, it's off and off to the next one. The next thing after that, then I start looking at getting into, like with the new bait balls, they give a little bit more variation in color density when you look at crankbaits, but it's the same thing. I'm going from light to dark, introduction of a little bit different colors, but still in that bright to dark range. My money bait, the bait that I throw probably 90% of the time, is in the gizzard shad. And I'm using between these two baits here, this is a ghost blue, or excuse me, a silver pearl and a ghost blue. That ghost blue is more of like a translucent body on it, but it has a purple cast. If any of you guys fish Winnebago much? So when you see the gizzard shad when they die off, when they first die, they've got that purple kind of iridescent look to them. That ghost blue is a perfect match to those. And I'm just using Winnebago as an example because I fish that a lot. You'll have days where cloud cover just starts coming over, that ghost blue just ends. Then I'll switch over, and it's just making that subtle difference from the more purple cast to that to giving more of the blue cast to that, and that blue will actually bring out more pink in the sunlight. Those type of subtle changes, that's all I'm looking to do at a time. And I'm just quickly, one bait, 4 or 5 casts in that area. If I know that there's fish that are hitting, quick change. 4 or 5 casts, nothing, I'll change into something else. So now I've gone from something very light, I'll go to something dark. If I'm not getting bit, I go back into that light color range, make a subtle change. If that's not the cure, then the next thing I'm looking at is getting into the body profiles of them. And even within the profiles, you get, like in here, they look very common. You got 3 different styles of stick baits in this. Having the banana backs, having your traditional stick, and then in these sucker bodies, the sucker bodies, you've got a little bit more tubular, more straight. In the rainbow smelt patterns, we've got more of a taper, and just the subtle differences between these. What they're going to give me is one body style is going to take and give me a very tight wiggle as it's going. The next bait, this is going to give me more of a long or elongated, a narrow wobble, where the bait just kind of thumps side to side. Then in the banana baits, which most guys are used to these for running up like Door County, etc. A lot of trolling guys will use these, and they got that real wide wobble to them as they flick back and forth. But again, that's all I'm looking for, is just subtle changes in the profile, and it's a matter of just keep changing. Some of the other ones that I'll do is, if I'm doing okay in the gizzard shad or in the taller body profile baits, sometimes I'll change over to the crawfish, and it's not so much that they're feeding on the craws, it's just something that's in that change to body style. Something a little bit more smaller profile, something more round. I'm just looking for something for aggression, just whatever's going to trigger off that hard bite where they're going to roll up on it. these baits, like for instance in August when I'm fishing young of the year bluegill bites, where you get bass and walleye stacked up on the weed beds of 2 feet of water, I'm generally doing fantastic on baits of this nature, but on occasionally that bite will just slow right down and I'll start getting those curiosity nips. We'll change right over and go into something a little bit more small, something that's going to give a little bit more wobble, or I might go into something that's a little bit more of a tighter wiggle in a small stick, and it'll just make all the difference. One of the other things come up, and this is just to kind of really touch on, looking at the cost of crankbaits. We all hate spending money, and things in the industry don't get any cheaper. Research and development doesn't get any cheaper. But I get so many guys in the boat and they start looking like at the Copper Live Target, and they're looking at some of the higher end natural pattern baits that are on the market. You know, I get it right away. Hey, just out of curiosity, how much do these baits run? And when I say 11, 12 bucks a piece, I see their jaw just bounce off the back deck of the boat. And I understand it. I'm a consumer just like everybody else. But when I sit back at the end of the year and I start looking at the money that we spend on gear, just some of the things that I start looking at is what I spend a year just in gas, traveling around, my truck, maintenance on my boat, my electronics, lodging, food, other gear, guys that are buying live bait, you know, clothing so I can be out in every conditions. So at the end of the day, when I look at it, when I've spent $11,000, $12,000 through here, and I go over and I look at shad wraps or flicker shads, and I look at another bait that's only $2, $3 a piece, kind of starts looking like it really isn't a significant number, only, you know, a couple dollars a piece. But those are just some of the things that I look at and just trying to address. I got a couple samples of these up close that look a little bit better, and I'll shoot these around for everybody. But when I'm referring with the natural color, some of the other things that I'll look at in these is the UV differences. Oops. I'll pass this around. One of the other things that you'll see starting to come out on a lot of the different crankbaits, if you want to pass these side by side, is that when you look at the companies that are producing natural type baits, you're going to start seeing more of a metallic finish. You're going to see the UV or dull finishes, and you're going to see a standard gloss finish. And what's really unique, and I've got the Markham LX9 camera. So in the summer months now, what I've been doing is I've been investigating spots. The other thing I've been doing is dropping these down and taking a look at them from the camera. And it's really intriguing to look at these baits when they're 6, 8, 10 feet underwater, when you start looking at the color spectrum range of them. Baits, when you look at them and they're that real dull UV finish to them, you put those baits down at 9, 10 feet, and it's amazing how shiny and how real they look, where you take a bait that's in a natural gloss finish, something we've always been accustomed to looking at, and you see that the color starts looking a little bit more muted. So when I'm making my choices and what I'm purchasing, what I'm starting to look for now is to get something in like those, in the natural, or excuse me, taking something that's in the natural, like if I'm looking for baits that it's going to represent a sucker minnow, I've been having really good where I'm getting a little bit more of the orange tannin here. Sorry, I don't remember what the color code is on this one, but this is available in the matte or the UV finish as well as the standard. And it's really unique to see the days, just the subtle differences that finish can make on a bait. And again, it's just making those little things, and I see so often guys will get stuck on the one pattern just because they've been bit. So adding to your success over the year, when you get in those moments where you get that 2 or 3 quick bites on a spot and you're not hooking up on them, or you're hooking them and you see that they're just barely hooked by the lip, be quick and prompt about it. If you have that second rod rigged, get right back in on them. Use a different color, the other profile, but make changes fast. Don't sit on that pattern for 2, 3 hours because you got nipped on it a couple of times. And it'll really change the way you've been chasing down aggressive bites. A lot when I'm looking at weeds, and this really makes a big difference for me in bait selection. If I'll go to a lipless bait or if I'm going to a bait that's got bill to it, You see how heavy and dense the top weed mat is? But yet look how sparse it is beneath here. Where lakes now where we're starting to see more milfoil show up, and that milfoil isn't all the way down. It's kind of like what they run into down south in Florida. You got these massive mats, and then you get these big holes like this. Also, you'll start getting more sporadic where you get these gaps in between the weeds. I'll start fishing lipless baits just like a blade bait, and kind of like with the bass guys that are punching, they'll take them 3/4 ounce jigs and punch it through the weed mat. You'll see me out on lakes that are like this in the spring, opening weekend, May, first Saturday, second. Usually, most time I'm chasing a walleye bite, but I'm also looking for the bass because the bass will be in with them. What I'm doing is I'm taking lipless baits. These holes like this, I'll spot them, and like anything, if you start making traditional long casts with a crankbait, throwing 50, 90, 100 feet out, all you're going to do is sit and rip weeds. But I'll take those lipless baits, just give them a gentle pitch, and where these chairs out, right here in front of me, that's all as far as I'm just pitching those baits out, keeping my line tight to that bait, just like I would if I was pitching or jigging a sonar or blade bait. And what I'm doing with those lipless baits, let it flutter down into these holes, and then just sit there and just give them a quick couple pulls, hold them steady. I'll hold my line up off the edge of the weeds, so that bait's just sitting there a foot off the bottom, just sitting. Give it another little lift, nothing. Rip it up through the weeds, pitch out for the next clump. And that has been a great springtime tactic for me that most guys will overlook. And anybody passing by me in another boat looking at me, they're gonna, what the heck's this guy flipping for bass, so early in the spring. They have no idea what, we're doing that time of year. Some of the other things I'll look for that just kind of tie in with your question. This is a known. I know that up on this rock bar, walleyes come in and spawn on this. A lot of times when I'm looking and targeting specifically for walleyes, I'm always looking at post-spawn. As soon as they're finished up, they're going to mud flats. They're going to get off that rock, they're going to get off that pea gravel, and they're going to look for muck. In this particular lake, this is all emerged weeds. This is all like 2-3 feet deep. It's too shallow, not the right type of weeds. And what I'll find is when I start getting out off the contour in this particular lake, and this is just getting out and seeing what other structure isn't always shown, this turns into a cabbage patch weed, or a spot right outside of there when you go out as far as about 12 feet of water. And what I'll find is these fish, they're always going to move off their spawning grounds to the nearest, most healthy or most suitable habitat with food. This boat, I'm sitting in about 2 feet of water. You can see the edge of the reeds sticking up here. That water is only that deep. From there, we're just kicking out 5 feet of water, 6 feet water. Many lakes that you'll see around here where you got a little bit of reed or cattails, there's no weeds for 15, 20 feet, and then you get that wall of weeds start in. That's what we're fishing here. We're sitting in that blank spot. The weed line is basically just right here. And that's all we were doing, is just right off the side of the boat. Just looking at one other variation of weed beds. This is one of the areas where I use my side imaging very extensively. When I was mentioning about seeing those holes in the weeds from a dense weed mat that would be up top, here's just the reverse of it. And what I'm seeing is this is a just real dense mat down here. That real dense mat is not going to hold as many fish in it, but what you will get is fish that are just over, and I'm talking active fish, not less than neutral or negative. These fish that are going to be hanging out and cruising through these holes, one, it's easier for them. They can cruise through this effortlessly. They're feeding and they got ambush points. So this is a type of weed bed that I'm looking for when I'm looking at my side imaging. When I'm starting to throw like those lipless baits, or even in a build, when I see this, I know I can throw a build bait in here, and what I'm going to be doing is coming down, stick in the weed, give it that 1, 2, give her a snap, pop it off of there. And I always like snapping them off of weeds, just been more of a happy than just really, sitting there jerking and trying to get all the weeds off. Because usually what happens when you give them that first snap, that bait, is it's coming here, it'll stick. You give it that snap and it just pops it forward. Now you got this bait starting to float up through here, and that's the point that's usually triggering most of your bites, is that quick dart and it just starts floating up like it's an injured minnow. But definitely tying in your electronics and look at what you've got available, because these things will start pinpointing a little bit more into what you can throw and what you should be looking at, especially for depth range. I don't see what is on here, but again, if I know that this is 12 feet deep, I've got the bottom 3 foot is a dense mat that I can't get bait through, or is a non-productive zone. This zone that I'm looking at is going to be in the right around that 7-9 foot mark. So that right away I'm going to key into a bait that's going to get me at a normal retrieve right around in that 8-9 foot. If I'm looking to cover as much water as fast as I can, lipless bait.